Hi everyone, welcome back to this GRE crash course. We're still here in analytical writing, and last time we looked at the issue task, and if you haven't watched that video yet, I'd recommend going back just because we're going to skip some of the really basic stuff about the essay section that we already covered. However, the argument task is very different from the issue task, and you don't want to approach both essays the same way. So to get started, let's just leap right in and look at a sample argument task. Just like before, I've mocked up a little picture of what it'll look like on test day. I don't want to use an actual ETS picture because I don't want to get in trouble for using their material, but there are really just three things to pay attention to here, right? You are going to get your prompt in this box here, and you'll notice it's much longer than the issue prompt. It's a full paragraph. You'll have your task down here telling you what to do, and then in this white box is where you're going to write your essay, and you'll have a timer counting down. You'll have 30 minutes, and your score is just based on whatever you get down in this white box when time runs out. To start off with, go ahead and pause the video and take a little time to read through this prompt and this task. So the prompt itself is always about a paragraph long, and you'll notice it's much longer than the issue task. The issue task is just a one line, uh, here's an opinion, do you agree or disagree? Whereas in the argument task, you're being presented with someone else's argument, right? And so this whole paragraph, which is usually a letter to the editor or a memo or some sort of recommendation, is always the formulation of someone's argument with some pieces of evidence and the conclusion that they've arrived at. And invariably, the prompt is going to ask you where are the places where this author has either made some unbased assumptions, where they've left out evidence that they should have included, or they've left questions unanswered that you would like answered before you could take their argument seriously. I know that for some of you, when you read this, nothing struck you as off. You just sort of took it at face value. You said, that's some good evidence, and that's a likely conclusion. Doesn't seem like there's anything wrong. If you think like that, you are going to need to change the way that you think in order to adequately respond to this prompt. So let's just take a look at one of these lines. The first one. In surveys, Mason City residents rank water sports, swimming, boating, and fishing, among their favorite recreational activities. Sounds like a good reason to clean up this river. Sounds like a good reason to improve the facilities here. However, they just say in surveys. And this is a classic one. If they ever mention surveys or if they mention reviews or complaints and things like that, you always want to question how valid is it, right? How recent was the survey? How many people took the survey? Was it randomly distributed or did people choose to take it? Did the survey have a ton of questions, a ton of options for what you could rank as your favorite recreational activity, or was it just yes, I like water sports, no, I don't like water sports, right? So it's all those little things that you want to be suspicious of. Just to take one more line, let's look at the second one. The Mason River flowing through the city is rarely used for these pursuits, however, and the city park department devotes little of its budget to maintaining riverside recreational facilities. So that second half probably doesn't seem off to some of you. Oh, they're only devoting a little of their budget to maintaining this place. We probably should increase that. Well, if the budget is extremely big, a small portion of it might be perfectly adequate to maintain these recreational facilities. So if mentally you are making the assumption that you think these facilities are somehow not well kept or aren't very good, there's no reason to assume that just based on what's shown here, right? And so something that you might want to examine is how much money is needed exactly for these facilities. Are they, are they already well funded given the amount that's budgeted to them? If we move to the ETS website, you can see that just like for the issue task, we have a bunch of information on the argument task. And again, we're going to look at some of the most important things. So just like the issue task, they make note that there is no one type of essay they're looking for. So if you're wondering, do I need to write a 5 paragraph intro, bodies, conclusion? The answer is no. It's not a bad way to structure it, but stylistically, there isn't a right way to respond to this. However, when it comes to the organization, there are some things that you want to do. So here in the second and third paragraph, they go over what a 6 would look like. And they say, that might begin by briefly summarizing the argument, so having some sort of brief introduction, and then explicitly stating and developing the main points of the evaluation. So what does that look like? What are all these main points? So I think that there are two main ways to respond to this. You can either do it by developing several points in an evaluation, or identifying a central feature in the argument and developing that evaluation extensively. So what this can look like is either sort of a listing of the most important things that you've pulled out of the prompt that you want to talk about, or selecting one big core idea and then sort of branching off from that into its smaller uh, sort of subsets within it. If we navigate over to the sample essay responses, we're going to take a look at, it's actually this prompt that we were looking at before, and they have here a couple of sample essays along with the response from the grader. So if you want to, again, take a second, pause the video, I'll scroll through here kind of slowly, and take a read through the number 6. And again, if this is important, come back to this website, read more of these, see what it looks like as the scores progress down. But what I'm mostly concerned with is this rater commentary again. In comparison to the responses that we saw from the issue task, you can see there are some similarities, right? They care about you being insightful and thorough. They also care, at the end, we can see they talk about being cogent and conveying meaning skillfully. And just as before, right, don't sweat the small stuff when it comes to little errors of grammar and spelling. But what is different is that there are kind of a limited number of ways to respond to this prompt. Whereas in the issue task, it wouldn't matter what position you took or what examples you used. On the argument task, they have set up a particular argument with particular inconsistencies or assumptions made, and they want to see that you have responded to those specific ones in the prompt. And so you can see that the rater has mentioned the three big ideas that this essay responds to, and I would say that there's really only a handful of things that you could respond to given this task. If we scroll back up to the top of the page, just like with the issue task, you can see there is a pool of argument topics. And here we have a list of all the possible topics that you might see on the test. So these are real prompts from the actual GRE. So if you are working out of a prep book, don't waste your time with the fake prompts they give you in there. If you're going to practice this, come to the ETS website and use the real prompts from the test. So again, just like last time, I want to take one of these prompts and go through a process that I think is good for practicing as well as for actually drafting your essay on test day. So here I've just taken the top prompt from the list. So pause the video and take a second to read through this and the task itself. And what you'll notice is that the task here is asking for specific evidence. So it's a little different from the original prompt we were looking at, right, which was looking at stated and or unstated assumptions. And actually, if you look on the pool, as you scroll down, you'll see that it's really three types of prompts that show up more than any. They're either asking for questions, evidence, or stated or unstated assumptions. And as you go down, right, questions, questions, evidence, evidence, assumptions. So you want to get used to these three types of task. It's going to be one of the three, and really they're all closely related, and the drafting process is pretty similar for all of them. So if you remember when we were looking at the first prompt, we talked about how the survey was something that we could bring up. We could talk about its validity, how many people took it, was it random? We talked about the budgeting, was it adequate, right? And so the same thing here, I want you to go through and take it line by line and try to come up with a list of as many as you can, really. I would say early on, aim for at least 3 to 5, which is enough for test day. But as you get better at this, you really want to push yourself to come up with as many as possible. So go ahead, pause the video, and take about 5 minutes to come up with as many, in this case, specific evidence that you would need to evaluate this argument. If you did pause it and you took some time to come up with some ideas, hopefully some of the ones you came up with are some of the ones I came up with. Again, if they aren't, don't worry about it. You know, obviously this is not a exhaustive list of everything you could have identified, but I will say that a lot of these prompts are set up with some sort of low-hanging fruit ideas that they expect you to respond to. So let's go through this list and just look at a couple of them and try to identify why is this a good question to ask? Why is this a good piece of evidence to suggest we need? So looking at number 1, I wanted to know how distinctive this style is. Or I guess if I were to phrase this in the passage, I would just say the evidence that would need to be presented is precisely what this particular distinctive pattern is. And why is that important? Well, the author is claiming that these so-called Palaean baskets were not uniquely Palaean, saying that other cultures were able to create these baskets too. And so what I want to know is, what is this distinctive style, right? If this distinctive style is just blue circles, right? The chance that some other culture might have just happened to make baskets with blue circles seems kind of high to me. But if that particular distinctive pattern was a series of shapes in a certain order, and the chance that someone else just randomly reproduced it is extremely low, well then maybe there is more evidence pointing to, no, that's probably from Pelea and it somehow got to this other place. Looking at number two, I would want to know how long baskets can even last, right? So one thing that stuck out to me was that it says that Pelea is a prehistoric village. How is it that these baskets are surviving so long? If they were made out of some extremely unique, durable fiber, something like that, that would be important to know. Likewise, number three, how are these baskets preserved? Perhaps the only reason that they haven't rotted away is that a stack of them happened to get preserved in a certain warehouse in Pelea that got covered in volcanic ash or something like that, right? And so in both cases, you can sort of see how, depending on what the evidence shows, it might either weaken or strengthen the argument, and that's really what we're looking to do, right? If it turns out that these baskets are extremely prone to rotting away, but a small number of them happen to be preserved in Pelea, that's not necessarily telling us that only Paleans had this basket. It's just that due to chance, the only ones we have left happen to be preserved in Pelea. Hopefully you can go through this process with the other ones I've come up here and also articulate sort of the things that you've come up with on your own and think about, well, how would I turn this into a paragraph? So that's what I want to do now. I want to take one of these points and try to figure out how are we going to work this into our essay. Keeping in mind that there isn't any one correct way to write this essay, you are best served, I think, by just looking at some of those high scoring essays and figuring out, well, how can I emulate what they're doing? But if you are looking for a template, especially for the body paragraphs, I think it can help when you go to write to make sure that you don't get lost by having a couple core concepts that you work into every body paragraph. So the first thing is just making sure that you present your evidence, your question, or your assumption that you plan on talking about. So again, right, you have those three different prompts. Make sure you're responding to the correct one. Number two, make sure that you let the reader know why this is important, right? I find a lot of people write this and they leave things implied without stating them explicitly. You want to be explicit. You want to let the reader know, I understand that this is an important question because it has this bearing, right? It carries weight when it comes to what the author is concluding. And thirdly, indicate ways in which this evidence or this question or this assumption could hurt or help the argument. And this often revolves around using hypotheticals to elaborate on how this could be the case. So I've taken a little time to just mock up what I think would be a decent body paragraph in response to this prompt. And again, I'm just trying to detail what it looks like to follow this general template. So the first thing I want to do is establish, what is this piece of evidence that I want to question? In this case, in evaluating this argument, it would be helpful for the author to provide the exact detail of the pattern that is considered Palaean. So this is what I want to talk about. And if this were a different prompt, I would have a question here or an assumption. Number two, why is it important? The author claims that the baskets found in Lithos could not be Palaean, but fails to elaborate on how distinctive this Palaean style actually is. Right? So if the author is going to claim that this basket is not unique to Pelea and it happened to also show up in Lithos, it would be nice for us, as readers being asked, is this true or not, to know exactly what this pattern is. And then number three, we want to pose sort of two hypotheticals, both sides. Could the answer to this question, could this piece of evidence, could the implications of this evidence hurt what the author is trying to say or help what the author is trying to say? So first off, if the pattern is something simple, perhaps a tree or a common shape, it isn't hard to believe that such a pattern could arise somewhere else simply by chance. So that, in a way, is sort of how it could help the author's argument, right? Yeah, that makes sense. If they couldn't have traded, it's possible that baskets also just happen to show up with the same kind of pattern. However, if the pattern in question is extremely detailed and unique. The claim that it could have arisen by chance just across the river without some sort of influence from Pelea seems unlikely and casts doubt on the author's conclusion. Now, of course, you don't need to follow this to a T every time you write a paragraph. What this is, at least to start off with, I think is a good way to begin thinking about writing your paragraphs, and it's also something to keep in mind if you get halfway through a paragraph and you realize, I don't really know what to write about next. Is my paragraph, is it done? Do I have everything I need? Mentally run through these three things. Do I have the evidence? Do I have that idea? Have I told the reader why it's important? And have I posed a couple hypotheticals to sort of say, well, this is how it could go in the author's favor or against? Now, just a last note about writing this. If we go back to the ETS website and we look at some of these good essays, you can see that the introduction and the conclusion tend to be the shortest paragraphs, and they're pretty rudimentary in what they're doing here. And you'll see that's sort of the case with the five as well. And so what I would recommend is going back and reading some of those just so you don't really have to think too hard about what is it I want to say with an intro or a conclusion. Right? Keeping in mind that they really aren't that important when it comes to your score here. Generally, you just want to summarize, what is the argument about, and then maybe make a comment about how the author needs to respond to this evidence or needs to answer these questions before we can take their conclusion, seriously. I want to end on a couple things that you definitely don't want to do, as well as a couple things that you do want to do for this essay. So to start off with, there are three things that you definitely don't want to do. And the first one is you don't want to give your own ideas about the issue. You don't want to agree or disagree. So you got to switch gears from the issue task where you were being asked to do this. So what does this look like? Well, given this prompt, you wouldn't want to write something like this. If they haven't found Palaean boats yet, the archaeologists need to continue searching for them. So here, you're telling the author what needs to be done. You're suggesting that this is the course of action, and you don't want to do that. Also, you wouldn't want to find a line like this. I agree with the author's conclusion about the Palaean baskets because blank, right? For some people, that's a natural thing to write given this prompt, but what they are looking for is not this. So stay away from these types of things. Number two, make sure that you do not question the facts in the prompt. It is definitely okay to raise some questions about the assumptions or what the author is implying, but when they state something as a fact, it is not up to you to question it. So for instance, this prompt tells us that there were baskets found in Pelea. That's not something that's worth bringing up. You don't want to say, were these baskets really found in Pelea, or are the archaeologists lying to us, right? So, treat the facts as facts, but then question sort of the implications of those facts. And lastly, you never actually want to come out and say the author is wrong, right? So you wouldn't want to say something like the author is mistaken in assuming that these baskets could have, arisen in Lithos or whatever. And the reason is because even though we're being told to sort of play devil's advocate and come up with all the reasons the author might be wrong, we still want to leave room for the author to be entirely correct in everything that they have assumed, right? So at the end of your essay, it's not that you have persuaded the reader that the author is incorrect. It's that you have persuaded the reader that the author has done an incomplete job in justifying their conclusion. In contrast to that, there are a couple things that you do want to do when they show up. So first off, you always want to address the validity or the quantity of reviews, criticisms, surveys, complaints, and other things of that nature. So what does this look like? You'll see statements like a majority of the complaints received were in regards to blank, right? Or um, surveys have shown that our customer base prefers such and such. And so when you see these things, you want to question them just on the basis of, well, are they valid, right? Are all the complaints coming from the same person, right? Were these surveys randomly distributed? And then also the quantity, right? How many complaints? If it's a majority of 3 complaints, that's way different than a majority of 1,000 complaints, right? Same thing with surveys, right? How many people were surveyed in this particular study? Another thing that you always want to do is address the numbers. So whenever they mention percentages, rises, falls, increases, decreases, typically those come with some assumptions sort of baked in. For instance, attendance at our event has fallen by 20%, right? Or we can expect the population in our town to surge to 10,000 over the holiday season. So things like this. Why are these in question? Well, that first one, attendance at our event has fallen by 20%. Is that a fall from 10 people to 8 people? That might not matter, right? If this is just some open house at a small venue, but if this is, we've gone from 10,000 people down to 8,000 people, well, that's a much bigger decrease, and maybe that is something worth looking at. Same thing with the population surging, right? You might want to ask in this case, well, what is the population before it surges to 10,000? Is the population at 9,000? Well, then that's not too big. Is the population normally 2,000? Well, okay, well then yeah, if the population is surging fivefold, then it's a much bigger deal than if it's increasing by 10 or 20%. And this is where I'm going to leave off. So I hope that these two videos on the analytical writing section were informative and helpful. If you have any other questions or you just want to know more about something that I only touched briefly on, leave it in the comments and I'll try to get back to you. Otherwise, I hope that you're finding these videos helpful and that you'll join me with the rest of this crash course. Thanks.